March 5th, 2000. Burbank, California. 6:11 p.m. 20 seconds. Touchdown to impact. A 737 lands 44 knots too fast. Wet runway. No safety margin at the end. Thrust reversers. Maximum braking. Not enough. Blast wall. 7 traffic lanes. A gas station dead ahead. 142 people on board. 0 dead. The captain knew the approach was wrong. The first officer knew. The GPWS screamed. Nobody stopped. How does a pilot who knows he should go around choose to land instead? Southwest Airlines is the 4th largest airline in the United States and the largest Boeing 737 operator in the world. Over its more than 50-year history, the airline has operated almost exclusively 737s, and by the year 2000, it had built a reputation as one of the safest carriers in American aviation. It had never had a fatal accident. Flight 1455 on March 5, 2000 was supposed to be a routine late afternoon hop from Las Vegas to Burbank, an hour and 15 minutes gate to gate, a route that the crew had flown so many times it barely required thought. But routine is where complacency lives, and complacency was already on board before the engines started. In command was Captain Howard Peterson, 52 years old, a former Air Force pilot who had flown for United Airlines, Wien Air Alaska, Coleman Air Transport, and EG&G before joining Southwest in 1988. He had approximately 11,000 hours total, nearly 10,000 of them on the 737. Colleagues described him as an average pilot with a friendly, easygoing attitude. His first officer was Jeffrey Irwin, 43, a 12-year Air Force veteran who had been with Southwest since 1995. Irwin had about 5,000 hours, half on the 737, and captains who had flown with him called him above average. He was also active in the Air Force Reserves, where he still flew the F-16, something he had done as recently as 2 days before this flight. Both pilots had been off duty for an extended period before this trip, which was the first leg of a 3-day, 5-flight sequence. Peterson lived in Las Vegas. He would have been well-rested, relaxed, and thoroughly familiar with every mile between McCarran International and Burbank. But a couple of things about this particular flight were slightly different from the usual. Despite Las Vegas's famously dry climate, thunderstorms had been rolling through the area all afternoon, triggering a wind shear warning at McCarran, a rare event. The storm stretched along the entire route to Southern California, and the aircraft that was supposed to operate Flight 1455 had been delayed on the ground in Los Angeles for nearly 2 hours. When Peterson and Irwin arrived at the gate, their scheduled 2:45 departure time had already passed with no airplane in sight. The 737 finally showed up at 4:30. The crew hurried through boarding and pre-flight checks with unusual speed. By 4:50, just 20 minutes after the aircraft arrived, Flight 1455 pushed back with 137 passengers and 3 flight attendants. For a 737 turnaround, 20 minutes is remarkably fast. The pace was set. This crew was making up time. That 20-minute turnaround deserves closer examination because it reveals the operational tempo that shaped everything that followed. A standard 737 turnaround at Southwest, deplaning passengers, cleaning the cabin, boarding new passengers, loading baggage, refueling, completing pre-flight checks, typically requires 35 to 45 minutes. Southwest had built its entire business model around fast turnarounds, famously pioneering the 10-minute turn in its early years. But even by Southwest's standards, 20 minutes from gate arrival to pushback with 137 passengers was aggressive. The cockpit voice recorder did not capture the turnaround itself, but the pace suggests that the pre-flight briefing was abbreviated and the crew's mental preparation for the flight ahead was compressed. Neither pilot appears to have discussed the implications of the extra fuel weight on their landing distance at Burbank, or the fact that the thunderstorms along the route might affect their approach. The focus was on departure, getting off the ground and getting to Burbank, rather than on what would happen when they arrived. This is a well-documented psychological pattern in aviation. When a crew feels behind schedule, the urgency of making up time narrows their attention to the immediate task and reduces their capacity for anticipatory planning. The delay had not just cost them 2 hours. It had cost them the mental space to think ahead. During the performance calculations, the pilots noticed the aircraft was heavier than normal. 3,000 extra pounds of fuel had been loaded to allow a return to Las Vegas if Burbank was not available, a sensible precaution given the weather. But that extra weight meant the 737 would arrive near its maximum landing weight, and heavier aircraft need more runway to stop. At Burbank, runway mattered. Here is what most people do not know about Hollywood Burbank Airport. It sits in the southeastern corner of the San Fernando Valley, wedged between terrain on almost every side. A mountain rises to 3,000 feet immediately east of the field. The Hollywood Hills reach 1,700 feet, a short distance to the south. The airport has two runways, 08/26, running east-west, and 15/33, running northwest-southeast. Due to the terrain, only runway 08 had an instrument landing system, and the vast majority of traffic landed in that direction. The reciprocal, runway 26, was nearly unusable for airliners because of the hills 3 nautical miles from the threshold. And runway 08 itself was only about 6,000 feet long, short for a commercial jet, especially a heavy one on a wet day. Beyond the departure end of runway 08, there was no grassy overrun area, no engineered safety zone. There were 32 feet of open concrete, then a solid metal blast fence designed to deflect jet exhaust away from North Hollywood Way, a busy 4-lane city street that ran directly past the threshold of runway 26. On the other side of that street sat a Chevron gas station. The flight itself was uneventful. Peterson flew, Irwin monitored. They climbed to cruise altitude, deviated around a couple of thunderstorms over the Mojave, experienced some mild turbulence, and began their descent after less than an hour. The cockpit voice recorder captured them chatting about their careers and about a 1988 United Airlines incident at San Francisco that was now used as a training scenario. They also discussed what to expect at Burbank. The latest weather showed an 18-knot tailwind on runway 08, which was too strong for a landing in that direction. Peterson commented that they would probably need runway 33 instead. He could not recall ever using runway 26. He gave a brief approach briefing. Visual approach runway 33, flaps 40, and the local altimeter setting. Quick and simple. Then, at 6:02 p.m., the flight was handed to the woodland sector of SoCal approach. The first thing the controller told them was to expect an ILS approach to runway 08, the default instrument approach, the one every pilot knew by heart. The wind had apparently died down. For Peterson, this was good news. Runway 08 with an ILS was far more familiar than a visual to runway 33. The task, in his mind, had just gotten easier. 30 seconds later, the controller issued a speed restriction. Maintain 230 knots or greater until advised. The purpose was spacing. A business jet was approaching from the northwest, and keeping flight 1455 fast would open a gap. The pilots acknowledged without concern. Speed restrictions on approach to busy airports are routine, but this particular speed restriction created a problem that was not routine at all. At 230 knots, a Boeing 737-300 at near maximum landing weight carries an enormous amount of kinetic energy. Kinetic energy increases with the square of velocity, meaning that at 230 knots, the aircraft carries roughly 2.8 times more energy than at 138 knots. Dissipating that energy requires either distance or drag or both. The available drag devices on a 737 during approach are the speed brake, the landing gear, and the flaps, deployed in sequence as speed decreases. But the flaps have speed limits. Flaps 1 cannot be deployed above 250 knots, flaps 5 above 250, flaps 15 above 200, flaps 25 above 190, flaps 30 above 175, and flaps 40 above 158. This means the deceleration must happen in stages, each stage requiring time and distance before the next flap setting can be selected. At 230 knots with only 8 miles of track remaining, the arithmetic was brutal. The crew needed to lose 92 knots in approximately 2.5 minutes, while simultaneously descending 2,300 feet, turning to align with the runway, and configuring the aircraft through 6 flap stages. It was not difficult, it was physically impossible. The controller had set a trap without knowing it, and the pilots had walked into it without calculating it. Their calculated reference speed for landing was 138 knots. They now had to lose almost 100 knots between their current position and the runway threshold, and the controller had not said when the restriction would end. Here is something critical that happened next, and it involves a concept that every airline pilot must understand perfectly: energy state management. An aircraft's energy state is the combination of its speed, altitude, weight, and configuration at any given moment. To land safely, a pilot must dissipate excess energy, bleed off speed and altitude, in a controlled manner, arriving at the runway threshold in the correct configuration at the correct speed. The tools available are time, distance, drag devices such as flaps and speed brakes, and thrust management. If a pilot runs out of time and distance before dissipating the energy, the approach cannot be stabilized, and the only safe option is a go-around. On this evening, the controller was about to take away both time and distance simultaneously. At 6:05, the controller cleared Flight 1455 to descend to 5,000 feet and turn left to a heading of 160 degrees. This heading would intercept the runway 08 approach course at just under 8 nautical miles from the threshold, 6 miles closer than the standard 10 to 15. The shortcut eliminated 6 miles of track that the pilots could have used to decelerate. It also rendered the 230-knot speed restriction unnecessary, because the increased distance to the business jet behind them was now built into the geometry. But the controller forgot to cancel the speed restriction, and the pilots did not ask. According to the Aeronautical Information Manual, an approach clearance automatically cancels any previous speed assignment, but the controller never said so explicitly, and the captain did not appear to realize he was free to slow down until almost a full minute after receiving the visual approach clearance, by which time the aircraft was abeam Van Nuys Airport, only 6 miles from the runway, still fast, still high, and still not configured for landing. The visual approach clearance came with one more restriction: cross Van Nuys at or above 3,000 feet. Van Nuys is one of the busiest general aviation airports in the world, and the altitude restriction kept airliners above its traffic pattern. But the instruction was ambiguous. When could they descend below 3,000? As soon as they passed abeam the Van Nuys VOR, or only after clearing the airspace entirely? Peterson chose the conservative interpretation: stay at 3,000 until well past Van Nuys. He could have asked the controller to clarify. He did not. The consequence of that choice was devastating. By the time Peterson began descending from 3,000 feet, the aircraft was only about 4 nautical miles from the runway threshold. Taking into account the airport elevation of 720 feet, he needed to lose roughly 2,300 feet in 4 miles. The required descent angle was 7 degrees, more than twice the standard 3-degree glide path. Losing that much altitude that quickly would cause airspeed to increase, not decrease, because the pilot must pitch the nose down, and the aircraft was already fast, still near 200 knots, with flaps barely started. At this moment, 4 miles out, 7-degree glide path, 200 knots, heavy, wet runway, 6,000 feet long, gas station at the end, a go-around was not just advisable. It was the only option. Every parameter screamed it. But Peterson did not go around. He did not discuss the situation with Irwin. He simply pushed the nose down and started chasing the runway. Every airline in the world uses what is called the stabilized approach concept. The idea is simple. By a predetermined altitude, typically 1,000 feet on an instrument approach or 500 feet on a visual, every parameter must be within a narrow, acceptable range. Speed within 10 knots of target. Descent rate under 1,000 feet per minute, gear down, flaps set, runway aligned. If any parameter is outside the range at that gate, the pilot must go around. No exceptions. Southwest Airlines called this being in the slot. But in 2000, the rules at Southwest were softer than they appeared. Procedures said that if you were not in the slot, you were not prepared for a normal landing. But they did not explicitly state that a go-around was mandatory. The language left room for interpretation, and Southwest pilots interpreted it liberally. An independent review later commissioned by the Airline Pilots Association found that Southwest culture actively encouraged pilots to attempt visual approaches from difficult positions, viewing the ability to complete aggressive approaches as a mark of skill. Fast, steep, slam dunk approaches were common. They saved time and fuel. Many pilots believed that practicing difficult scenarios in real operations kept their skills sharp. The review also found that Southwest's training program did not adequately teach energy management during visual approaches, and did not emphasize the need to properly brief those approaches. The independent review, conducted by aviation psychologist Dr. Robert Helmreich and his team at the University of Texas Human Factors Research Project, went further. It found that Southwest's operational culture had created an environment in which go-arounds were viewed not as a normal safety tool, but as a failure, a sign that the pilot could not handle the approach. The data supported this. Southwest's go-around rate was significantly lower than the industry average, not because its pilots flew better approaches, but because they were less willing to abandon approaches that were not working. Helmreich also identified a pattern he called normalization of deviance, a term borrowed from sociologist Diane Vaughan's analysis of the Challenger disaster, in which repeated success with technically non-compliant approaches gradually shifted the crew's baseline for what was considered acceptable. If a pilot had flown 50 unstabilized approaches without incident, the 51st felt no different. The deviation became the norm. The warning signs, speed, sink rate, GPWS alerts, became familiar nuisances rather than urgent signals. By the time Peterson lined up on runway 08 at 200 knots and 7 degrees, he was not ignoring warnings. He was operating within the boundaries of what his experience had taught him was normal. The problem was that his experience had been teaching him the wrong lesson for years. The culture was, in a word, macho, one of the 5 recognized hazardous attitudes in aviation. I can do it. Watch me land this. The GPWS fired at 6:10. Sink rate, neither pilot acknowledged. The aircraft was descending at more than 1,000 feet per minute, speed still near 200 knots, flaps only partially deployed. Peterson called for flaps 30, then immediately added flaps 40. Put it to 40, it won't go, I know that. It's all right. Final descent checklist. He knew the flaps would not extend to 40 degrees above 158 knots. The 737's flap load relief system physically prevents it. He was telling Irwin, I know we are too fast, but the flaps will catch up once we slow down. It was not a correction, it was a hope. Where was the first officer in all of this? Irwin later said he heard the sink rate alerts. He saw the speed. He knew they were not in the slot. But he consciously decided not to call it out because, in his assessment, the captain was aware and already correcting. This reasoning defeats the entire purpose of pilot monitoring. The monitoring pilot's job is to call out deviations regardless of what the flying pilot appears to be doing, precisely because the monitoring pilot cannot be inside the flying pilot's head. The whole point is redundancy, a second pair of eyes confirming what the first pair might be rationalizing away. Irwin's silence was not deference, it was the collapse of crew resource management. The GPWS escalated. Pull up, pull up. This was no longer a caution. This was the last automated warning before terrain impact. Peterson's response, captured clearly on the cockpit voice recorder. That's all right. The first officer said nothing. At Southwest and many other airlines in that era, pilots were trained that a pull-up warning could be disregarded if the runway was in sight and the pilot could verify with confidence that no terrain threat existed. The logic was that steep visual approaches to airports like Burbank could trigger nuisance warnings. The result was a culture in which the most serious automated safety warning in the cockpit had been psychologically downgraded to background noise. Flight 1455 blasted through the 500-foot stabilization gate without a word from either pilot. Speed, approximately 50 knots above VREF. Descent rate, over 1,000 feet per minute. Flaps, not yet in landing configuration. The captain later admitted he knew at 500 feet that he was not in the slot. He said he understood that procedures required a go-around. He could not explain why he did not go around. What happened was target fixation, a psychological state in which the pilot becomes so focused on reaching the runway that all other information, including warnings, parameters, and the first officer's presence, ceases to register. The industry calls it get-there-itis. It is especially common in experienced captains who have done the same thing hundreds of times and cannot conceive that this time might be different. And this is the crux of what made this accident possible. Every time Peterson needed to make a decision, Something small rewarded his choice to continue. The runway changed from the unfamiliar 33 to the familiar 08. Easier. They broke out of clouds and saw the runway. Visual. Even easier. The high descent rate must be the 20-knot tailwind at altitude. It will die down closer to the ground. The picture out the window? Looks about right. Yes, a bit high and fast, but he had been high and fast at Burbank before. It had always worked out. Each tiny confirmation fed the next, building a chain of false reassurance that led him straight through every warning gate without stopping. At 170 feet, roughly 6 times the normal flare height, Peterson began raising the nose. 9 seconds later, the 737 touched down at 182 knots. The threshold was already 2,150 feet behind them. The normal touchdown zone ends at 1,500 feet. They had 4,150 feet of wet runway remaining. Calculations later showed they needed 4,700 feet to stop, even with maximum braking. From the moment the main wheels hit the concrete, a runway overrun was physically inevitable. Nothing the pilots did from that point forward could change the outcome. Peterson deployed thrust reversers and applied manual braking immediately, far earlier than normal. The aircraft decelerated, but not fast enough. The flaps finally reached 40 degrees, far too late. Onlookers at Burbank's passenger terminal watched the 737 hurtling down the runway, clearly moving too fast to stop. In the cockpit, the realization arrived. The nonchalance that had carried Peterson through the approach evaporated. The blast fence filled the windshield. Beyond it, North Hollywood Way. Beyond that, the Chevron station. Peterson grabbed the nose wheel tiller and steered right, trying to angle across the ramp and through the open airport fence to avoid a head-on collision with the blast wall. But using the tiller while braking threw the aircraft into a skid, reducing brake effectiveness even further. At 6:11 and 20 seconds, the 737 clipped the right edge of the blast fence and careened through the airport perimeter wall at 32 knots. The nose gear collapsed. The aircraft slid across 7 lanes of North Hollywood Way, struck one car, pinning its hood beneath the fuselage, and came to rest at the edge of the Chevron station's parking lot. The nose of the 737 sat directly beneath the station's price sign. A photograph taken moments later became one of the most recognizable images in aviation safety. A commercial airliner parked at a gas station, its sheared-off nose pointing at the pumps. Inside the car that was struck, a woman and her 4-year-old daughter were uninjured. On the aircraft, the forward escape slide had inflated inside the galley during the impact sequence, blocking both forward exits and trapping 2 flight attendants on the collapsed forward jump seat. There was no fire. If there had been, that blocked exit would have been catastrophic. But the 142 people on board evacuated through the rear and overwing exits. 2 passengers suffered serious injuries. 41 passengers and the captain sustained minor injuries. No one died. The cockpit voice recorder captured what came next. In the silence after the aircraft stopped, Peterson said 2 things. The first was, "My fault." The second was, "Well, there goes my career." Those 6 words contained everything. They proved that Peterson understood exactly what had happened. They proved he knew it was his decision, his fixation, his failure to go around. And they proved that this understanding arrived only after the aircraft stopped moving. 20 seconds too late, 2,150 feet too late, 44 knots too late. For the entire approach, from the moment he pushed the nose down at 4 miles out to the moment the wheels hit the concrete, Peterson had been operating inside a bubble of false confidence, sealed off from his own knowledge by a culture that rewarded aggression, and a mindset that interpreted every warning as manageable. That's all right. It won't go, I know that. Well, there goes my career. The progression from dismissal to acknowledgement took less than 90 seconds. In that 90 seconds, 142 lives passed within 3 meters of a gas station. The NTSB found that the probable cause was the flight crew's excessive airspeed and the steep glide path angle, combined with their failure to abort the approach when stabilized approach criteria were not met. Contributing was the controller's positioning of the aircraft in a manner that left no safe option other than a go-around. Both pilots were fired. Southwest admitted their actions were negligent. The FAA suspended both licenses for 1 year. But the investigation reached deeper than 2 pilots. The independent review exposed a systemic culture at Southwest that normalized unstabilized approaches, underemphasized energy management training, used ambiguous go-around language, and permitted pilots to override GPWS warnings based on visual assessment. Southwest implemented reforms after the accident, and yet, 5 years later, on December 8, 2005, Southwest Airlines Flight 1248 overran the runway at Chicago's Midway Airport in snow and ice, slid onto a city street, and killed a 6-year-old boy in a car. The crew had decided to land, despite unfavorable conditions, due to a perceived pressure to complete the approach. The pattern repeated because the culture had not changed fast enough. Burbank Airport responded to Flight 1455 by purchasing the Chevron station and an adjacent business, demolishing both and replacing them with empty lots. The airport then installed a $4 million engineered materials arrestor system at the departure end of runway 08, a bed of crushable concrete blocks designed to stop a runway excursion by absorbing the aircraft's kinetic energy through its collapsing landing gear. In 2006, the EMAS stopped a private jet with no injuries. In 2018, it stopped another Southwest 737, proving that when engineering replaces hope, the system works. Howard Peterson had 11,000 hours. He had flown Las Vegas to Burbank hundreds of times. He knew the runway was short, the end was a wall, and the gas station was there. He knew at 500 feet that he was not in the slot. He knew procedures demanded a go-around. And he landed anyway, because every flight before this one had ended safely, and he could not imagine that this one would not. That is the trap of experience. The belief that because something has always worked, it will always work. It is the most dangerous assumption in aviation, and it does not announce itself with alarms or warnings. It announces itself afterward, in a quiet cockpit, with 6 words. My fault. Well, there goes my career. If this story changed how you think about the line between confidence and complacency, consider subscribing, because in the next episode, we will look at what happens when that line is crossed not by one pilot, but by an entire industry.